The wind howled like a dying beast across the Arizona desert as the stagecoach wheels screamed against the rocky terrain, its horses wild with fear. Inside, a woman's muffled sobs cut through the chaos. Lillian Hartwell, her gloved hands trembling as she clutched a locket to her chest. The only thing left of a life she'd lost. The outlaws had already taken everything else, and now they wanted her. The door burst open, a shadow lunging toward her, his breath reeking of whiskey and violence. She kicked, she screamed, but the night swallowed her voice whole. Then, hoofbeats. Thunderous, relentless. A lone rider emerged from the dust, his silhouette sharp against the blood-red moon. Jesse Callahan didn't hesitate. His revolver roared to life, and the desert lit up with fire and fury. One shot, two. The bandits fell like puppets with cut strings, but the rider's eyes never left hers. There was something in them, something darker than the night, deeper than the secrets she carried. He reached down, his calloused hand gripping hers, pulling her up behind him. "Hold on," he growled, his voice rough as gravel. She should have been grateful. She should have trusted him. But as the horse tore through the darkness, Lillian's fingers tightened around the locket, her heart pounding with a terrible truth. If he ever found out who she really was, he wouldn't just let her go. He'd wish he'd left her to die. This wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of a lie that would unravel them both. And by the time Jesse Callahan discovered the truth, it would be far too late to turn back. If you love stories where love and betrayal collide in the wildest of ways, hit that like button and subscribe to Saddle and Secrets, because this is one secret you won't want to miss. The storm had followed them like a curse. By the time Jesse Callahan's horse stumbled into the narrow valley, the rain was coming down in sheets, turning the earth to mud, and the night to something even darker. Lillian's breath was shallow, her body pressed against his back as the stallion fought its way up the slick trail. She could feel the tension in his muscles, the way his grip on the reins never wavered, even as the wind tried to tear them from the saddle. This man, this stranger, had pulled her from the jaws of death without a second thought. But why? What kind of man rides into an ambush like that, outnumbered and outgunned, for a woman he doesn't even know? The cabin appeared like a ghost through the downpour, its wooden bones groaning under the weight of the storm. Jesse swung down first, his boots sinking into the mud as he reached up to lift her. His hands were rough, but his touch was careful, as if she might shatter. Lillian hesitated. The locket burned against her skin, a silent reminder of everything she was hiding. If he knew, if he ever found out, this fragile trust would turn to ash. But the cold was biting deep, and the wound on her arm throbbed with every heartbeat. She had no choice. She let him guide her inside. The cabin was small, the air thick with the scent of pine and gunpowder. A single lantern flickered on the table, casting long shadows that danced like demons on the walls. Jesse moved with the quiet efficiency of a man used to solitude, stoking the fire before turning to her. "Sit," he ordered, nodding toward the wooden chair by the hearth. His voice was low, gravelly, the kind of voice that made her think of whiskey and broken promises. She obeyed, watching as he rummaged through a worn leather bag, pulling out a bottle of whiskey, clean cloth, and a needle threaded with what looked like horsehair. "This is gonna hurt," he warned, pouring the whiskey over the wound without waiting for her answer. The fire of it stole her breath, and she gasped, her fingers digging into the arms of the chair. He didn't flinch, didn't apologize, just kept working, his focus absolute, as if he'd done this 100 times before. Lillian studied him through the haze of pain. His face was all sharp angles, high cheekbones, a jawline shadowed with stubble, and eyes the color of storm clouds. A scar ran from his temple to his cheek, pale against his sun-bronzed skin. This was a man who'd seen violence, who'd dealt it too. Yet his hands, as they wrapped the cloth around her arm, were surprisingly gentle. "Who are you?" she whispered. The question slipped out before she could stop it. He paused, just for a second, his gaze flickering to hers. "Name's Jesse Callahan," he said finally. "And you're safe here. For now." The way he said it, like a promise and a warning all at once, sent a chill down her spine. Safe. The word tasted like a lie. She wasn't safe. Not from the men who were still hunting her. Not from the truth. And certainly not from the way her pulse jumped when he looked at her like that, as if he could see straight through her. She dropped her eyes, focusing on the locket again. It had been her mother's, the only thing her father hadn't taken from her when he'd sold her off like property. The Blackwood name was engraved on the back, hidden beneath her fingers. If Jesse saw it, if he recognized it, he'd know. And then what? Would he throw her out into the storm? Worse, would he turn her over to the very men he'd just killed to save her? The fire crackled between them, the only sound in the heavy silence. Jesse leaned back, his broad shoulders stretching the fabric of his shirt. "You're not from around here," he said. It wasn't a question. Lillian swallowed hard. "No," she admitted. "I was heading west, to California." Another lie. Another piece of the story she'd fabricated to keep herself alive. He nodded slowly, as if he'd expected as much. "Well, you won't make it far in this storm. Not alone." The way he said it made her wonder if he was talking about more than just the weather. She should have been afraid. She was afraid. But there was something else, too, something warm and dangerous curling in her chest. Gratitude, maybe, or something foolishly close to trust. Jesse stood abruptly, moving to the small stove in the corner. "Soup's old, but it's hot," he muttered, ladling something that smelled like beans and bacon into a tin bowl. He handed it to her, their fingers brushing for the briefest moment. Lillian's breath caught. It had been so long since anyone had shown her kindness without wanting something in return. She ate in silence, watching him from beneath her lashes. He didn't ask her name. Didn't press for answers. But she could see the questions in his eyes every time he looked at her. Questions he wasn't voicing. Yet. The locket felt heavier with each passing minute. She should have taken it off. Should have hidden it better. But it was the last piece of her mother she had left, and God help her, she couldn't let it go. Jesse suddenly stiffened, his head tilting like a wolf catching a scent. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lillian froze, straining her ears. At first, there was nothing. Then, faint, but unmistakable, the distant sound of hoofbeats. Her blood turned to ice. "They found me," she breathed. Jesse's expression darkened. He moved to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peer into the night. "3 riders," he said grimly. "Coming fast." He turned back to her, and for the first time, she saw doubt in his eyes. "You got enemies, Lillian?" The way he said her name, like he already knew it was a lie, made her stomach twist. She opened her mouth to answer, but the words died in her throat. Because in that moment she realized the truth. It didn't matter who was out there. The real danger was right here, in this cabin. In the man who'd saved her life and would destroy her if he ever learned the truth. And the riders outside? They were the least of her worries. The riders outside weren't just looking for her. They were waiting. Jesse could feel it in his bones, the way the night itself seemed to hold its breath. He pressed his back against the cabin wall, the cold wood biting through his shirt as he listened. 3 men, just as he'd thought. But it wasn't their numbers that troubled him. It was the way they moved, slow, deliberate, like hunters who knew their prey was already cornered. His fingers tightened around the revolver at his hip. "Who are they?" he asked again, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. Lillian's face was pale, her knuckles white where they clutched the edge of the table. She didn't answer, didn't have to. The fear in her eyes said enough. Jesse had spent years reading silence. It was the quiet ones who lied the best, the ones who carried secrets like knives, ready to strike when you least expected it. And Lillian? She was drowning in them. He crouched beside the window, peering through the crack in the curtains. The riders had stopped just beyond the tree line, their shapes barely visible in the moonlight. One of them dismounted, his boots crunching in the frost-bitten grass. Jesse's jaw clenched. They weren't here to kill her, not yet. They were here to take her, and that meant she was worth more alive than dead. He turned back to her, his voice a low growl. "You got a price on your head?" The question hung between them, heavy as the storm outside. Lillian's breath hitched. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her gaze flickering to the locket at her throat. Jesse's eyes followed the movement. Something dark and suspicious coiled in his gut. "That necklace," he said, stepping closer. "Let me see it." She recoiled, pressing it against her chest like a shield. "It's mine." The defiance in her voice was new, sharp as a blade. And that's when he knew. Whatever she was hiding, it wasn't just about her. It was about him, too. Before he could react, she bolted. Not for the door, she wasn't stupid, but for the stove, her fingers scrambling for the iron poker. Jesse lunged, catching her wrist before she could swing. "Easy," he warned, his grip firm but not cruel. Her eyes burned with desperation. "You don't understand," she whispered. "If they find me, if he finds me." "Who's he?" Jesse demanded. The riders outside shifted, their voices carrying on the wind. "We know you're in there, Callahan. Hand her over, and we'll let you walk." The name sent a jolt through him. They knew who he was, which meant this wasn't random. This was personal. Lillian's breath came in ragged gasps. "Please," she begged. "Just let me go. I'll run. I won't tell anyone." "Tell me what?" Jesse snapped. The truth was a living thing between them now, twisting and writhing, refusing to stay buried. She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "My father. He's Elias Blackwood." The name hit him like a bullet. Blackwood. The man who'd burned Jesse's family ranch to the ground. The man who'd left his younger sister to die in the flames. The man he'd spent the last 5 years hunting. Jesse's grip on her wrist loosened, his mind racing. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a trap. Blackwood had sent his daughter here, to him, knowing Jesse would never let a woman be taken by outlaws. Knowing he'd protect her, even from the truth. A slow, bitter laugh clawed its way up his throat. "All this time," he murmured, "you've been playing me." Lillian shook her head violently. "No! I didn't know it was you! I swear I didn't!" "You expect me to believe that?" His voice was a whip crack of fury. "You're his daughter. You think I don't know how he works? He uses people, breaks them, just like he broke me." The riders outside began to advance, their footsteps heavy on the porch. Jesse's instincts screamed at him to fight, to kill them all and be done with it. But his eyes were locked on Lillian's, searching for the lie. And then he saw it. The way her lower lip trembled, the tears spilling over her lashes. "I didn't ask for this," she choked out. "I didn't ask to be his daughter. I didn't ask to be sold off like cattle to pay his debts. I ran. And then you found me." The raw pain in her voice cut through his rage like a blade. For the first time, he hesitated. Outside, a fist pounded on the door. "Last chance, Callahan. Hand over the girl, or we burn this place down with you in it." Jesse's mind raced. He could give her up, walk away, let Blackwood's men take her and finally wash his hands of this mess. But then she reached for him, her fingers clutching at his sleeve. "Please," she whispered. "I'm not like him. I never wanted to be." And God help him, he believed her. The decision was made in an instant. Jesse grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the back of the cabin, where a narrow trapdoor led to the cellar. "Down," he ordered, "and don't make a sound." Lillian didn't argue. She disappeared into the darkness just as the first gunshot splintered the door. Jesse turned, his revolver steady in his grip. If they wanted a fight, he'd give them one. But as the cabin filled with smoke and the roar of gunfire, one thought burned brighter than the rest. What in hell have I just done? And more terrifying, why did I do it? What would you do in Jesse's place? Trust the daughter of the man who destroyed your life? Or hand her over and finally get your revenge? Let me know in the comments. The cellar was a tomb of shadows, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and old blood. Lillian pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her breath coming in shallow, silent gasps as the world above them erupted into chaos. Gunfire cracked like thunder, each shot vibrating through the floorboards, rattling her bones. She could hear Jesse moving overhead, swift and lethal, his footsteps punctuated by the grunts of men falling. She should have been terrified of him. He was a killer, a man who'd spent years drowning in vengeance, who had every reason to hate her. And yet, as the muffled screams of the attackers filled the cabin, all she could think was, he stayed. He chose to fight for me. A floorboard groaned. Lillian froze. The trapdoor creaked open, and a sliver of lantern light cut through the darkness. Jesse's face appeared, his features sharp with adrenaline, his shirt darkened with blood. She couldn't tell if it was his or theirs. "They're gone," he said, his voice rough. "For now." He dropped down beside her, his body tense, as if he expected the walls themselves to turn on him. The silence between them was heavier than the gun smoke still lingering in the air. Lillian's fingers trembled as she reached for him, then stopped. "You're hurt," she whispered. A gash ran along his ribs. The fabric of his shirt stuck to the wound. Jesse didn't look at it. His eyes were locked on hers, dark and unreadable. "You lied to me," he said finally. The accusation hung between them, raw and bleeding. Lillian flinched. "I didn't know who you were. Not at first." "And after?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "After you saw the locket? After you heard my name?" She swallowed hard. "I was afraid." "Afraid of me? Or afraid of what I'd do if I found out the truth?" The question was a knife twist, deliberate and cruel. She looked away, her fingers tightening around the locket. "Both." Jesse let out a bitter laugh, scrubbing a hand over his face. "You know what your father did to my family?" He didn't wait for an answer. "He didn't just take our land. He burned our home with my sister inside. She was 12 years old, Lillian. 12. The pain in his voice was a physical thing, something she could feel pressing against her chest, stealing her breath. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear, I didn't." "Of course you didn't," he snapped. "Because Blackwoods don't dirty their hands with the truth. They just let other people bleed for it." Lillian's vision blurred with tears. "I'm not him," she said, her voice breaking. "I never wanted any of this. I ran because I couldn't—" "Couldn't what?" Jesse demanded, leaning in. "Couldn't stomach the life he planned for you? Couldn't bear to be his pawn anymore?" She nodded, a sob escaping her. "He sold me. To a man twice my age. A man who—" She couldn't finish. The memory of her father's cold smile as he'd handed her over still made her skin crawl. "I'd rather die than go back." The words hung between them, fragile and honest. Jesse's expression flickered. Something like pity, maybe, or understanding. But then it hardened again. "Convenient," he muttered. "Now I'm supposed to feel sorry for you?" Lillian wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I don't want your pity. I just want to live." Jesse turned away, his jaw clenched. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant howl of the wind. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled wanted poster. He tossed it onto the dirt floor between them. Lillian's stomach dropped. The poster was old, the edges frayed, but the name at the top was unmistakable. Elias Blackwood. Wanted. Dead or alive. Beneath it, a list of crimes. Arson, murder, theft. Each one a stain on her family's name. And there, at the bottom, a reward so high it made her sick. She looked up at Jesse, her voice barely a whisper. "You were going to turn him in." "I was going to kill him," Jesse corrected, his voice flat. "But you're worth more to me alive." The words were a punch to the gut. "You're going to sell me out." It wasn't a question. Jesse didn't deny it. "I should." He stood abruptly, pacing the small space like a caged animal. "I should drag you back to the nearest town, collect the bounty on your head, and finally put an end to this." Lillian's hands curled into fists. "Then do it." She met his gaze, her chin trembling but her voice steady. "But you won't." Jesse stilled. "What?" "You won't," she repeated. "Because if you were going to, you'd have done it already." A muscle twitched in his jaw. "You don't know what I'm capable of." "I know you saved my life," she shot back. "Twice. Even after you found out who I was. So either you're the worst bounty hunter in the West, or you're not as heartless as you pretend. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jesse stared at her, his chest rising and falling with each ragged breath. Then, without a word, he turned and climbed back up through the trapdoor, leaving her alone in the dark. Lillian waited, her heart pounding, until she heard his boots cross the cabin floor. She expected him to leave, to ride away and never look back. But then the trapdoor creaked open again, and Jesse's voice cut through the darkness, rough and reluctant. "Get up here." She hesitated. "Why?" "Because," he growled, "if I'm stupid enough to let you live, you're sure as hell not spending the night in a cellar." Lillian climbed the ladder slowly, her body aching with exhaustion. The cabin was a wreck. Bullet holes in the walls, the table overturned, the fire reduced to smoldering embers. Jesse stood by the window, his back to her, his shoulders tense. "We can't stay here," he said. "They'll be back." "Where will we go?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. When he finally turned to face her, his expression was unreadable. "There's a town, 2 days' ride north. A judge there who owes me a favor." Lillian's breath caught. "You're taking me to the law?" "I'm giving you a choice," he said. "You can turn yourself in, tell them everything you know about Blackwood. Or what? Or you disappear. Start over somewhere no one knows your name." The offer hung between them, dangerous and tempting. Lillian looked down at the wanted poster, still lying on the floor. Her father's face stared up at her, cold and unrepentant. She thought of the life she'd left behind, the gilded cage, the men who'd looked at her like she was property, the weight of the Blackwood name like a noose around her neck. And then she thought of Jesse, the way he'd fought for her, the way he'd looked at her when he'd thought she was just a woman who needed saving. "What about you?" she asked softly. "What do you get out of this?" Jesse's gaze darkened. "I get to watch Blackwood burn." The words were a vow, whispered like a prayer. "And you?" she pressed. "What do you want from me?" For a long moment he didn't answer. Then, slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. "I don't know yet." The touch was electric, sending a shiver down her spine. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the scent of rain and gunpowder. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf cried, lonely and wild. And in that moment, Lillian realized the truth. She wasn't just running from her past anymore. She was running toward something far more dangerous. Toward him. Toward a man who could destroy her with a single word. Toward a future she wasn't sure she deserved. Jesse dropped his hand, turning back to the window. "We leave at first light," he said. "Pack what you can." Lillian nodded, her throat tight. But as she moved to gather her things, her eyes fell on the locket, still clutched in her palm. The Blackwood crest gleamed in the firelight, a reminder of everything she was trying to escape. With a sharp intake of breath, she pried it open. Inside, nestled against her mother's portrait, was a single sheet of paper, folded so small she'd never noticed it before. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it. The words were written in her mother's hand, the ink faded, but the message clear. "If you ever need to disappear, go to Silver Creek. Ask for Martha Holloway. She'll help you." Lillian's heart raced. A way out. A real one. But as she looked up at Jesse, his profile sharp against the window, she knew the choice wasn't that simple anymore. Because leaving meant walking away from him. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure she could. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon like a thief, stealing the last shadows of the night as Jesse and Lillian rode out of the valley. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth, the world still half asleep around them. Jesse kept his eyes on the trail ahead, his jaw set, his fingers tight around the reins. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to leave her behind and ride as far and as fast as he could. But he didn't. Because somewhere between the gunfire and the confessions, something had shifted. She wasn't just Elias Blackwood's daughter anymore. She was the woman who'd looked him in the eye and dared him to see her, not as his enemy, but as something far more dangerous, as someone worth protecting. Lillian rode beside him, her posture stiff, her hands gripping the saddle horn like it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. She'd barely spoken since they'd left the cabin, her silence heavy with unspoken questions. Jessie could feel her eyes on him every time he glanced her way, as if she was trying to memorize the lines of his face, the way his scar twisted when he frowned. He didn't like it. Didn't like the way his chest tightened when she looked at him like that, as if he were the only thing standing between her and the abyss. "We'll reach the ridge by midday," he said finally, breaking the silence. "After that, it's open land to Silver Creek." She nodded, but her voice when she spoke was barely above a whisper. "And then what?" Jessie didn't answer right away. The truth was, he didn't know. Every plan he'd ever had revolved around one thing: making Elias Blackwood pay. But now, with Lillian beside him, those plans felt like ash in his mouth. "Then you decide," he said gruffly. "Turn yourself in. Or disappear." She was quiet for a long moment. "And you?" "I'll do what I always do," he lied. "Move on." The words tasted bitter, but he forced them out anyway. Because the alternative, admitting that he didn't want to let her go, was a weakness he couldn't afford. The trail narrowed as they climbed, the horse's hooves slipping on the loose rocks. Jessie kept one hand on his revolver, his eyes scanning the ridgeline. They weren't alone out here. He could feel it, the prickle at the back of his neck, the way the wind carried the faintest hint of smoke. Someone was watching, waiting. "We're being followed," Lillian said suddenly, her voice tight. Jessie didn't bother to ask how she knew. He'd spent enough time in the wilderness to trust that kind of instinct. "Stay close," he ordered, urging his horse forward. But it was too late. The first shot rang out like a crack of doom, echoing off the canyon walls. Jessie's horse reared, and he barely kept his seat as the bullet kicked up dust at his feet. "Ride!" he shouted, wheeling his horse around just in time to see the riders emerging from the tree line, 5 of them, their faces obscured by bandanas, their rifles glinting in the sunlight. Lillian's horse bolted, her scream lost in the thunder of hooves. Jessie cursed, digging his heels into his stallion's sides. He wasn't going to lose her. Not like this. The chase was brutal, a relentless pounding of hooves and gunfire as they tore through the canyon. Jessie rode hard, his body low over the horse's neck, his revolver barking in his hand. He picked off 2 of the riders before the others scattered, taking cover behind the rocks. Lillian's horse stumbled, and she nearly went over the edge, only barely catching herself. Jessie didn't think. He turned his horse sharply, reaching down to grab her arm and haul her up behind him. "Hold on!" he growled. And then they were off again, the wind whipping at their faces as the remaining riders gave chase. They didn't stop until the horses were lathered and trembling, until the canyon had given way to a narrow gorge, the walls so steep they blocked out the sun. Jessie slid from the saddle, pulling Lillian down with him. She collapsed against him, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body shaking. "They're still coming," she whispered. Jessie didn't need to look to know she was right. He could hear them. The distant but unmistakable sound of hooves, the occasional shout carrying on the wind. He pressed his back against the canyon wall, his mind racing. They were trapped, and if they didn't move fast, they'd be dead before sundown. "There's a cave," Lillian said suddenly, pointing to a dark opening half hidden by the brush. "Up there." Jessie followed her gaze. The cave was small, barely more than a crack in the rock, but it was their only chance. "Go," he ordered, pushing her toward it. "Now." She didn't argue. She scrambled up the loose rocks, disappearing into the shadows just as the riders burst into the gorge. Jessie took a deep breath, then stepped out to meet them. He didn't give them a chance to react. His first shot took the lead rider in the shoulder, spinning him out of the saddle. The second shot went wide, but the third found its mark, dropping another man before the others could dismount. Jessie didn't wait to see if they were dead. He turned and ran, his boots slipping on the rocks as he lunged for the cave. A bullet whizzed past his ear, close enough to singe the hair at his temple. He dove inside, rolling to his feet, just as Lillian pulled him deeper into the darkness. The cave was deeper than it looked, the air thick with the scent of damp stone. Jessie pressed his back against the wall, his chest heaving, his ears straining for the sound of pursuit. "They'll find us," Lillian whispered. They always do. Jesse looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her hands trembled not just from fear, but from something deeper, something broken. "Not this time," he said, his voice low and fierce. And then, before he could stop himself, he reached for her, pulling her against him. She didn't resist. She melted into him, her arms wrapping around his waist, her face pressed against his chest. For a moment, neither of them moved. Neither of them breathed. And then, slowly, Jesse's fingers found their way into her hair, tilting her face up to his. The kiss was desperate, hungry, a collision of lips and teeth and years of pent-up rage and longing. Lillian responded like she'd been starving for it, her hands clutching at his shirt, her body arching against his. It was madness. It was reckless. And it was the only thing that made sense in a world that had gone completely to hell. Jesse's hand slid down her back, pulling her closer, as if he could merge her into him, keep her safe from everything, from the men outside, from the past, from the truth that still hung between them like a blade. When they finally broke apart, Lillian's eyes were wide, her lips swollen. "Jesse," she started, but he silenced her with another kiss, softer this time, slower. "Don't," he murmured against her mouth. "Just don't." Because if she said his name like that again, if she looked at him with those eyes, he wasn't sure he'd be able to let her go. And that was a danger neither of them could afford. Outside, the riders were closer now, their voices echoing through the gorge. Jesse pulled away, his mind snapping back to the present. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice rough. "There's another way out. Deeper in." Lillian nodded, but her gaze lingered on his mouth, her breath still unsteady. Jesse forced himself to turn away, to focus on the darkness ahead. Because if he didn't, he'd lose himself in her. And losing himself meant losing everything. The cave narrowed as they moved deeper, the walls pressing in until they had to turn sideways to squeeze through. The air was thick, oppressive, the silence broken only by the distant drip of water. And then, suddenly, the cave opened up into a vast chamber, the ceiling lost in darkness, the walls glistening with minerals that caught the faint light from Jesse's lantern. Lillian gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Jesse barely heard her. His attention was fixed on the far side of the chamber, where a narrow tunnel led upward, the faintest hint of daylight visible at the top. "That's our way out," he said, already moving toward it. But Lillian didn't follow. She stood frozen in the center of the chamber, her eyes fixed on the wall behind him. Jesse turned, and his blood ran cold. Carved into the stone, half hidden by the shadows, was a symbol. A circle with a serpent coiled around it. The Blackwood crest. "No," Lillian breathed. "No, no, no." Jesse reached for her, but she stumbled back, her face pale. "This isn't just a cave," she whispered. "It's a hideout. His hideout." And then, from the darkness above them, a voice echoed down, smooth and deadly. "Well, well, if it isn't the prodigal daughter." The voice slithered through the cavern like a blade in the dark, and every muscle in Jesse's body locked tight. He knew that voice, had heard it in his nightmares for years, the smooth, venomous tone of a man who'd never known mercy. Elias Blackwood stepped into the lantern's flickering light, his boots clicking against the stone, his coat draped over his shoulders like a king's robe. His eyes, cold, calculating, flickered from Jesse to Lillian, and the smile that curled his lips was worse than any bullet. "Lillian, darling," he said, his voice dripping with false warmth. "You've caused quite the stir." Lillian didn't move, didn't breathe. She stood frozen, her fingers digging into Jesse's arm as if he were the only thing keeping her from drowning. Blackwood's gaze shifted to Jesse, and the amusement in his eyes turned to something darker. "And Jesse Callahan," he murmured. "The great avenger. The man who spent years hunting me, only to deliver my daughter right to my doorstep." His laughter echoed off the cavern walls, low and mocking. "Poetic, isn't it?" Jesse's hand hovered over his revolver, but he didn't draw. Not yet. He could feel Lillian's terror radiating off her, could hear the way her breath hitched in her throat. Blackwood wasn't alone. Shadows moved in the tunnel behind him. Men with rifles, men who'd kill Jesse where he stood if he so much as twitched. But none of that mattered. All that mattered was the way Lillian's grip on him tightened, the way her voice trembled as she finally found the courage to speak. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice raw but steady. "Not to you. Not to that life." Blackwood's smile faded. "You don't have a choice." He took a step forward, and Jesse's instincts screamed at him to act. But before he could move, Lillian stepped in front of him, her chin lifted, her eyes burning with a fire he'd never seen in her before. "I do," she said, "and I choose him." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Blackwood's face twisted, the mask of civility slipping to reveal the monster beneath. "You ungrateful little—" Jesse didn't let him finish. His revolver was in his hand in an instant, the hammer cocked back. The barrel pointed straight at Blackwood's heart. The cavern erupted into chaos. Blackwood's men scrambled for their weapons, but Jesse's voice cut through the noise like a whip. "One move," he growled, "and he dies." For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then, slowly, Blackwood raised his hands, his lips curling into a sneer. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You think she changes anything?" His eyes flicked to Lillian, and the hatred in them was enough to make Jesse's blood run cold. "She's my blood, and blood always comes home." Lillian's voice was barely a whisper. "Not this time." She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the locket, the last piece of her mother she had left. With a sharp twist, she wrenched it open, and the folded paper inside fluttered to the ground. Blackwood's eyes followed it, and for the first time, Jesse saw something like fear flicker across his face. "What is that?" Jesse demanded, his grip on the revolver unyielding. Lillian didn't answer. Instead, she met her father's gaze, her voice steady. "The truth," she said, "about what you did to Jesse's family, about the lies you've told, about the man you really are." Blackwood's face darkened. "You don't know what you're doing." "I do," she said, "and I'm done being afraid of you." For a moment, the cavern was silent. Then with a roar, Blackwood lunged. Jesse fired. The shot echoed like thunder, and Blackwood crumpled to the ground, his hand clutching his shoulder, his face twisted in pain. His men hesitated, their rifles wavering as they looked from their fallen leader to Jesse, who stood like a storm between them and Lillian. "Drop them," Jesse ordered, his voice deadly calm. "Or join him." One by one, the rifles clattered to the stone. Jesse didn't lower his weapon. Not yet. Not until he was sure. Not until Lillian was safe. He turned to her, his heart pounding, his mind racing. "We have to go. Now." She nodded, but her eyes were fixed on her father, on the man who'd spent her entire life controlling her, breaking her. And now, for the first time, she was free. They moved quickly, slipping through the tunnel and out into the blinding sunlight. The horses were gone, scattered in the chaos, but it didn't matter. Jesse grabbed Lillian's hand and they ran, their boots kicking up dust as they fled into the wilderness. They didn't stop until the cavern was nothing but a speck in the distance, until the only sounds were their ragged breaths and the wind in the trees. Jesse finally slowed, turning to face her. Lillian's cheeks were streaked with tears, her hands shaking, but her eyes were clear, alive. "It's over," he said, his voice rough. She nodded, but then she reached for him, her fingers curling into the front of his shirt, pulling him close. "No," she whispered. "It's just beginning." And then she kissed him. Not like before, not desperate, not afraid. This time, it was a promise, a choice. Jesse's arms wrapped around her, pulling her against him as if he could shield her from the world, from the past, from everything that had tried to tear them apart. When they finally broke apart, her forehead rested against his, her breath warm on his lips. "What now?" she asked, her voice soft but unafraid. Jesse looked out at the endless horizon, at the wild, untamed land that had been his home, his prison, his salvation. And for the first time in years, he didn't see the ghosts of his past. He saw her. "Now," he said, his thumb brushing her cheek. "We live." What would you have done in Jesse's place? Would you have trusted Lillian, or would you have handed her over to finally get your revenge? Let me know in the comments, and if you loved this wild ride of love, betrayal, and redemption, don't forget to like and subscribe for more heart-pounding stories from the Untamed West.